My name is Corey Malone, and this is the video version of my literature review on the efficacy of inquiry that will function as my final assignment for Education 501 seminar for the reflective teacher. I'm a teacher at the International Community School of Addis Ababa in sunny Ethiopia. I've been teaching humanities here for 5 years, and we have a very diverse student body of over 60 nationalities. There are a number of reasons why I chose inquiry as my topic for my literature review. Recently, there's been a big push for inquiry and inquiry-based practices such as problem-based learning in education. And the reasoning behind this makes sense. Inquiry is a constructivist approach. It encourages students to make meaning for themselves and in turn develop their critical thinking and problem-solving skills. So inquiry-based practices have become the new norm in education as schools around the world strive to integrate inquiry into their curricula. And my school, ICS, is no exception to this trend. Inquiry is one of our strategic objectives. It's explicitly articulated in the school vision and strategic plan. It is an IB and PYP school, so inquiry, action, and reflection are a big part of our school culture. My middle school, which I'm a part of, wants to go even further. We're talking about, in 3 years' time, implementing a schedule that allocates every Wednesday for problem-based learning. Even the interface we use for documenting all of our curriculum at the school, Atlas Rubicon, requires teachers to explain how inquiry is embedded in each unit of instruction. And my school has even gone as far as to create a position for a teaching coach whose sole purpose is to scaffold inquiry for teachers. Evidently, my school and educators around the world have invested a lot of faith in inquiry. And this leads to a bigger question. How do we know that inquiry actually works? Where's the data? What does the research say about the efficacy of inquiry? And that was the focus of my literature review. An excellent jumping off point for any discussion about the efficacy of inquiry in the classroom is the work of Professor John Hattie, who is the big name in metadata and meta-analysis in educational research. Hattie's study of visible learning has been the subject of debate and discussion in education for the past few years. And the question that drives Hattie's research is quite simple. It's what works best in education, what influences, what interventions, what strategies that teachers use have the greatest impact on student learning and achievement. And Hattie is very concerned with quantifying the effectiveness of each of these strategies. And to do so, he uses a number known as the effect size. And what Hattie found was that if he averaged the effect sizes of all of these strategies that he studied, he came up with a number of 0.40. This is his hinge point. So therefore, anything above that hinge point of 0.40, anything with an effect size above 0.40 is considered to have an above average impact on student learning. And anything below that hinge point of 0.40 is considered to have a below average impact on student learning. And when we look at Hattie's ranking of effect sizes, we find some pretty interesting stuff. Pretty high up on the list is direct instruction at 0.60, which is significantly above that hinge point of 0.40. However, if we want to find inquiry-based teaching, we have to go all the way down to the effect size of 0.35, which is fairly well below that hinge point of 0.40. And if we want to find problem-based learning, which is an inquiry-based practice that is kind of a big thing going on today in education, we find it's way down here at 0.12. So this would indicate that problem-based learning and inquiry-based teaching are actually less effective have a lower impact on student learning than something as traditional as direct instruction. However, when we read the section in John Hattie's book about inquiry-based teaching, he's very careful to explain why. What he found was that the studies he relied on looked at the numbers even more. They broke down that effect size even more, and they found that in science classrooms, inquiry-based teaching had an effect size of 0.15, about that, on content knowledge, which is fairly low. However, it had a fairly high effect size, above 0.50, when it came to scientific processes and skills. So in other words, inquiry is actually pretty good for teaching scientific processes and critical thinking, but not very good for teaching content knowledge. And in fact, I watched an interview with John Hattie where he explained this. He said, we often introduce inquiry-based teaching too soon, before we we impart those foundational skills and knowledge that students need to explore a topic. So inquiry-based teaching is good, but you need to have a platform, a basic foundation before you can use it effectively as a teaching strategy. Other studies I read corroborated what Hattie had to say about inquiry, and in fact some were even more critical of inquiry. One article in particular was scathingly entitled, "Why Minimal Guidance and Instruction Doesn't Work, an analysis of the failure of constructivist discovery, problem-based, experiential, and inquiry-based teaching." And in this article, the authors acknowledge that there is an understandable appeal to constructivist approaches such as inquiry, but that these approaches ignore what we know about cognitive architecture and empirical studies that compare guided and unguided instruction. According to the authors, research has shown that long-term memory has the biggest impact on problem solving because people draw on past experiences to solve problems, and they cite a number of studies to prove their point. These findings were echoed in another article I read entitled, "Should There Be a Three Strikes Rule Against Pure Discovery Learning?" And in this article, the author examines the results of 3 bodies of research comparing pure inquiry learning with guided inquiry. And what the author finds is that within each of these 3 areas, guided inquiry yields better results than pure inquiry. Another interesting study that I read was called "The Effectiveness of Inquiry-Based Science Education in Relation to Learners' Motivation Types." And this study was conducted in the Czech Republic. And in this case, the researchers broke students into 4 different groups, grouped according to their motivation types. And what they found was that when they used inquiry-based teaching methods on these 4 groups, their performances were considerably different. And this indicated that the effectiveness of inquiry-based teachings depends on the motivation of the learner. In other words, inquiry is not a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching. So this may lead you to wonder if there's any evidence that inquiry actually works. And in fact, I've only found one study thus far that really gives strong empirical data that indicates that inquiry-based approaches to teaching can actually work. And this is called "The Effects of Inquiry-Based Learning on Students' Science Literacy Skills and Confidence." And this study was conducted at the university level on undergraduate students, and they compared the results when students were taught the same course and given the same assessments, but one group of students was taught using an inquiry-based approach and the other was taught using the traditional direct instruction approach, and it was a science lab course. And in the end, they were given assessments on science literacy and process skills. And the students that were taught using the inquiry-based approach in this case did significantly better than the students taught using the traditional methods. But interestingly, the researchers also found that the inquiry students exhibited less confidence in their scientific abilities than the students who were taught using the traditional methods. Now, what about qualitative data as opposed to quantitative data? Remember what Hattie had to say about the effect size of inquiry in science classrooms? That it has a limited impact on content knowledge, but there's a certain indication that inquiry-based approaches has a pretty strong impact on science process skills. Well, there was one article that related to this that I'd read. It was called "Historical Inquiry and the Limitations of the Common Core State Standards." And this interested me as a social studies teacher and as somebody who uses the Common Core to assess writing. And in this study, the authors found that there's little quantitative data to indicate that historical inquiry-based approaches improve students' written argumentation when assessed using the Common Core social studies writing rubric. However, they also noted that there is qualitative evidence that such methods improve historical and critical thinking skills, and that, according to the authors, if we use different measures and social studies specific measures, we can actually turn this qualitative data into quantitative data. It can be quantified. So we've gone through quite a bit of information in this presentation. So a good way to end this is to really decide what are the big takeaways from all of this research. The first thing to consider is using a balanced approach to teaching. Inquiry is not a one-size-fits-all model. And as Hattie pointed out, it's not an effective way to deliver some of the basic fundamental content knowledge we expect kids to have. Sometimes to do that, we need some more traditional methods like direct instruction. And I've also found in my experiences that once students have that foundational knowledge, when they do engage in independent inquiry and research, they can develop far deeper understandings than they would if they're starting from scratch using pure inquiry. of the things I noticed in reading some of this research was that some authors treat inquiry as if it's an absolute. In other words, either teachers are engaged in direct instruction or pure inquiry. And this overlooks the fact that there are different levels of inquiry and that these levels can and should be scaffolded for students. We should be starting off with some structured forms of inquiry, moving on to guided inquiry, and then giving students a choice of engaging in pure inquiry. Last year I gave students projects where they were allowed to either choose one that I'd predetermined by the topic and the product they make, but they would still have to generate their own questions, or pure inquiry projects. And interestingly, I found for the most part, projects that I had given the students some parameters on were typically better than the pure inquiry projects because some students were just not ready to engage in that level of inquiry. As an educator, I sometimes feel like I'm working in a field that is in a state of perpetual reform, where creative destruction is the norm as we constantly seek new best practices to replace the old ways of doing things. And the problem is these best practices need to be substantiated using quantitative data. And based on my research, there's not a significant amount of data and empirical evidence that supports the use of inquiry in the classroom. However, like most teachers, I believe that inquiry is crucial for developing critical thinking skills. And the problem is the way we assess, the way we measure achievement relies on some outdated methods that favor things like content knowledge. This would include standardized tests and basic writing rubrics like the one I talked about in a certain study. And this indicates that we need more metrics. We need more ways to measure critical thinking and processing skills. Otherwise, our insistence on the value of inquiry is going to be based on qualitative data and gut feeling.